Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Even 7 years into Narendra Modi's dominance, there is a critical question that is still waiting for a perfect answer. What should we make of his character and his style of leadership? A recently published book addresses precisely this issue. Here it is. It's called Price of the Modi Years, and its author is the well-known journalist and columnist Aakar Patel. Aakar Patel, in the preface of your book, you explain that your intention is to explain the data and facts on India's performance under Narendra Modi through character flaws in its transformational leader. It's what you say about his character and his leadership style that I particularly want to focus on today. You write, he is decisive, full of certitude, transparent, unlearned, energetic, and charismatic. He has in particular a bravado that on occasion transforms into a reluctance to acknowledge facts. Unlearned but decisive, and yet energetic and full of bravado. That strikes me as a worrying combination of qualities in a prime minister. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. I think that all of us have flaws. It is to what extent these are mitigated by our circumstances, by those who work and live with us. I think that when you have an individual as powerful as Mr. Modi is today, with a full majority in the Lok Sabha, with no opposition within his party, and possessing of a great deal of certitude, these tend to go against that one flaw, which is his desire not to get into detail. And I think that for someone who is decisive, meaning someone who wants to take decisions and break from the past, this is quite worrying, and it is in fact dangerous.
In fact, the two adjectives that you used in that sentence which struck me were, you say he's decisive, but he's also unlearned. So in other words, without being sure and certain of what he's doing, he's still determined to go ahead and do it.
That is what Mr. Modi has told us. There's a wonderful interview that is on video with the journalist Madhu Kishwar, where he talks at length about his manner of functioning. This was in early 2014, when he had already been the chief minister for a dozen years or so. He says that he doesn't read files because that is academic study according to him. And what he does instead is he asks for 2-minute briefs to be given on subjects, and then he decides based on that. I think even that would not be particularly worrisome, should it not be for the fact that he's also extremely decisive and wants to do things which he believes will change the manner of the polity's functioning. And I think these two put together have brought India to where it is across a range of subjects.
Let's separate the 2 points you made and take them up one by one. Do you believe that Madhu Kishwar's story, that a man who's prime minister, who has to frequently take critical decisions, does so not on the basis of diligence, depth, and detail and understanding the issues by reading the files, but simply on a 2-minute brief from a bureaucrat? Because that's a very cavalier and casual attitude. Do you really think a prime minister would behave in this way?
This is not her story. This is these are his words. He's on video saying this. And he had spent a dozen years as the chief minister with this style, so he's fairly comfortable with it. So we can only assume that he's saying what is the truth.
In other words, this is from the horse's mouth, and he's hoisted by his own petard because he's saying it of himself.
I don't think he sees it as a bad thing, and I don't think that those who support him and think he's done the right things over the last 7 years, we are now in year 8, think that it's a bad thing. They believe that somebody who breaks from the past as violently as he has done and is doing is necessarily doing a good thing. And I don't think they set great store by the fact that he doesn't get into detail. Though I think the corpses of those bad decisions, those rashly taken decisions, have been all around us since 2014.
I'll come to what you call the corpses of the badly taken decisions in a moment's time. But first, let me pick up on the second part of that very important sentence you said a moment ago. That's to do with how he sees himself. You write, Modi sees himself in a heroic way. Modi has an intense desire to do something, and this yearning of Modi to do something, but not knowing what and not having an interest in depth or detail, has resulted in his style of running India. Do you really mean to suggest that more than anything else, he wants to make a big impression, what colloquially would be called a big bang?
I think so. I think somebody who refers to himself in the third person always, or most times, somebody who wears his name on a suit when meeting with the president of the US, somebody who claims to have a chest that is 56 inches around, is telling us that he is communicating a certain sort of self-image that he is held on to. This is not something that is a transient. Through the years that he's been a chief minister and he's been a PM, he has actually told us that this is the way he sees himself.
So let's just pause and see the picture that's emerging. This is a man who sees himself as a hero and he wants to act in a big, decisive way. Number two, this is a man who you say is unlearned. He doesn't read the files. He doesn't have depth and detail to do with critical decisions. And yet he acts with great certitude. Doesn't this suggest that he's impetuous and reckless?
I would say that these are two words that accurately describe him. These are, however, loaded with a certain emotion that I have chosen not to use in the book. But I don't see how it is that anybody who has examined his years in office and what the performance has been and what the numbers show would think that these words that you just used were wrongly used.
So you agree that the image you're portraying of the man is of a reckless and impetuous person who isn't too worried about the consequences. He wants to act and to be seen as a decisive actor.
That's absolutely accurate. And I think that that's really well put, that he doesn't really care about the consequences of what he does. What matters to him first is how he's seen.
And can you give the audience examples of things that have happened as a result of this impetuosity and recklessness and not caring about the consequences? Would demonetization be one of them? Would declaring a nationwide lockdown at 4 hours notice be another?
They would. And I think that to understand what is meant, we need to look at the layer below that, the layer below the decision. So the BBC filed over 200 RTIs to find out who in the government had been consulted or had been prepped before the national lockdown was called. And the answer was nobody. Nobody in government, whether disaster management or the finance ministry, knew that this was going to come. So the government didn't have the time to prepare for what was likely and what was almost certain to be quite a chaotic and painful period for the entire nation. But no care was taken to ensure that this pain was in some way lessened. A second example is that layer below the demonetization decision, where the cabinet ministers were called into the meeting on that same day, which is the 8th of November, and told to leave their cell phones behind. They had no inkling that this was going to happen later that day. Since the ministers didn't know, their departments didn't know, and the government did not prepare and did not think it appropriate to prepare for what was, I don't know whether Mr. Modi understood it, what the consequences of that act would be. I think that he was quite baffled towards the end of December when he came to terms with what it was that the country was going through. But he had not thought it through when he actually called it. And I think that asking a nation to do something when the government is not prepared for it, the government doesn't even know about it, is, I think, would certainly tell us in both these instances that he chooses to act first, to shoot first, and then to aim later.
You're almost suggesting, and I'm putting it to you for confirmation, that this is a man who's prime minister of a country with 1.38 billion people, and yet acts almost on a whim, sometimes even capriciously because the idea strikes him as good, without taking advice, without consulting his cabinet members, without preparing, and without thinking through what the consequences would be.
Yes, and I think what harms him further in this is that his charisma and his power coupled with his desire to work with only those people who don't have too much power themselves. If you look at Mr. Jaitley, Ms. Sitaraman, or Mr. Jaishankar, Mr. Goyal, none of whom has ever won a poll in their life. These are not people who can say no to somebody who they know is really popular. And so not having naysayers, not having somebody hold his hand and say pause, has led us to this.
Let's at this point come to another point you make about it, because the image you've created of Mr. Modi, his character and his leadership is exacerbated by what you say is his alleged lack of vision. You write, and I'm quoting you, Modi has no vision for Indian society other than to reject inclusion and the constant manufacture of laws targeting minorities. Do you really believe that a man who's won 2 massive elections and has ruled for 7 years has no vision?
So if we look at the policies and manifestos of the BJP and the Janasangh going back to 1951, we notice that there is no real consistency and there is no real ideology. So they stood for automation, and then they didn't want it in agriculture because the use of tractors would mean the slaughter of bullocks. They didn't want automation in any sector except defense and aerospace. They wanted the monthly income of all Indians to be capped at rupees 2,000, and this is the policy that they held on to for 20 years till under Mr. Vajpayee. So the RSS, a political force in India, has never had a particularly specific ideology that we can point to. It has retained its anti-minority and specifically anti-Muslim thrust, and we can see that in the legislation of laws post 2015. And then post 2018.
So you're saying that the party and the political tradition from which Mr. Modi has emerged, the Janasangh and then the BJP, have struck postures and taken positions, but they don't have an ideological coherence behind them. And frequently, they actually contradict themselves and change their positions, or their positions are illogical, such as you have a cap on salaries of 2,000 a month. Is that the background from which his lack of vision, in a sense, emerges?
Yes, there is no core. It's not just salaries. It's any sort of income is to be capped at rupees 2,000. And effortlessly, that same party gets into privatization, talks about laissez-faire economics under Mr. Modi. That same party, a few months down the road, goes Atmanirbhar, where its own advisors, including Mr. Panagaria, say that it's muddled, and so on. So there is no real a clarity of thought. There is one consistency, which is that let's go after the Muslims of India, exclude them politically, which they have quite successfully, and harass them and torture them constantly through law, which they are doing also extremely successfully.
Okay, I take the point you're making about the parties from which Mr. Modi has emerged being parties that posture rather than think ideologically. But what about Mr. Modi's behavior and performance of the last 7 years? Does that also suggest a lack of vision? Because people will say, Jan Dhan Yojana, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, Ayushman Bharat are a clear vision to help people at the poorest levels of society. And that's on the economic front. And then people will say, if you look at the way he's fairly dramatically changed by giving greater depth to the relationship India has with the United States, the United Kingdom, UAE, Saudi Arabia, shows there's also been a vision on the foreign affairs front. How would you counter those arguments?
Well, I think on the schemes, he's done reasonably well on several fronts, or tried to anyway. These are schemes that were inherited by him. All the ones that you mentioned, including Janadhan, direct benefits transfer. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was the continuation of a scheme called Nirmal Bharat. Nirmal means the same thing as Swachh. I don't know why it was renamed. So on the side of what the state does, there is some element of continuity. You could argue that it has been done with less competence than it had been done in the past, and it hasn't produced the sort of results that it should have. And I think I've documented some of that data. On the side of foreign policy, what he's done is he has changed the course of the way that India engages with the world. And I would say that this is actually quite negative, that there is an idea of this country that the world held for the most part of being chaotic but benign. I think it's transformed. And I think that the world feels the need to be able to interfere in what is going on with India, as has happened several times over the last few years. So from the United States to Europe, there are independent government bodies which have cautioned India, which have put India on lists, which have threatened to sanction India, which have tabled condemnatory motions against the laws that we have passed, which is new. This is not something that we have seen in our engagement with the world, especially the Western world, over the last 75 years. I think what Mr. Modi has done with his targeting of minorities, whether through central legislation or through the BJP states, is to bring to the world a sense of alarm about what is going on in India. And I don't think that that will just vanish, given what has been happening and continues to happen.
So in a nutshell, you're saying if there is vision on the economic front, it is someone else's vision, his vision he's inherited, his contribution is to continue, not to create that vision. And on the foreign affairs front, you're saying he may have brought greater depth to these relationships, but he's also created a sense of alarm about what's happening in India and also increased criticism about what he's doing to India's democracy. In other words, it's more negative than positive in your eyes.
I think that the word economic, I would not use. I would say, what are the elements and things that are done by the state? On the side of the economy, he has broken from the past. I think that we see before ourselves a fairly devastated landscape where 5 crore fewer people are working today than were working in 2013. And this is government data. If you look at the labor force participation rate from the two government surveys of 2013 and 2020. On the others, I think things like Swachh Bharat and so on, it is a continuation.
Okay. Now, in your book, writing about the impact on the country after 7 years of Narendra Modi's leadership, you write, and I'm quoting, Modi has taken India to a place where political parties do not speak of secularism and pluralism, though it is the basic structure of our constitution. What was once communal is now legitimate. What was secular has been made inauthentic. We can legitimately call it the Modi effect. You're acknowledging there, aren't you, that India, 7 years after Modi took over as prime minister, is a radically, fundamentally different country to what it was in 2014?
Yes, I do. And I don't think that the shift back will be easy. And I don't think the shift back will be automatic even after the BJP goes. And the reason I'm saying this is that society has become infected. One of the things Mr. Modi has done, which he also did in Gujarat, is to devolve the use of force from the state, where it sits legitimately in Weberian terms, to society. So you can have a mob shut down Muslim prayer in spaces that the state has actually allocated to them, and the state will not be able to resist that. You can have mobs on the streets of Gujarat taking hawkers down, while the BJP in that state says that they have nothing against the sale of eggs. So it's the mob that is actually taking decisions that the BJP has told us it wants to take, and it no longer needs the state to be able to do these things. So I think it'll be tough for us to go back to where we were before 2014, and I think it'll take a long time.
In other words, he's legitimized vigilantes, he's legitimized some form of mob rule. Society is no longer policed and in order. The majority does what it wants.
Indeed, and this is in some sense also legitimate, that there are laws, including in the state where I live in, Karnataka, which says that if the vigilante who accosts the person accused of carrying beef is acting in, quote, good faith, unquote, it is not a crime.
And all of this, you say, Modi has done through his person, not through the BJP. In other words, like a giant colossus, one man almost single-handedly has changed the character of our country.
I think so. I think that his personality, his thinking is writ large on the party. Today, it's not the other way around. I think it is impossible for the RSS or the RSS's head to be able to order Mr. Modi around. I think the cadre would laugh at them. I think that he is the most popular leader we have in the country. He controls a very large part of the population that loves him. I think that he is adored in a way that I have not in my 52 years seen a leader being adored. And I don't think we have had anybody of this charisma, this likability, this popularity, and with this much power.
Now, let's come at this point to the compilation of facts about India's performance under Narendra Modi, which, to be honest, is the main body of your work. You cite 53 indices to measure India's performance and point out that on 49 of them, India has declined. Its performance has only improved on 4. And this, I think, is your conclusion. The record leaves little room for debate or dispute. The scale and rapidity of decline in governance after 2014 is manifest. India was struggling to keep up with the world and sinking on several fronts. India deteriorated under Modi across the spectrum of governance in ways that are noticeable and objectively measurable. In other words, what you're saying is Modi as Prime Minister is a failure if performance is to be the criteria of judgment.
Absolutely. I think there is no dispute over this. And the indices that I referred to also come from fairly conservative bodies like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the Economist Intelligence Unit. These are not what we would see as being liberal left type institutions. And I think that across a range of things, we have declined in a way that is noticeable. And I think we have declined in a way that's alarming in many ways, that we have not been able to make this a subject of a political debate. The facts are not in dispute. I think the government can say what it does when things like the World Hunger Index comes out. But what is true and what the numbers show is that we are in a difficult space, and I don't think it will be easy for us to get out.
And when Mr. Modi makes speeches lauding his achievements, applauding his government, you actually say this is just babbling. That's the precise word you use, babbling.
We should look at the numbers that his own government has put out. GDP growth fell into sequential decline for 13 quarters from January 2018. Why? We don't know because we haven't debated this. We can say that we are moving towards a $5 trillion economy or a 5 million ton economy, according, which is what Mr. Shah said. How will we get there and by when? I think that these are not questions that are asked. There is empty rhetoric, which to my mind is actually babbling. It's not based on anything. We have a lower work participation rate than Pakistan. GDP per capita has gone behind Bangladesh, which was 50% behind us in 2014. So they've not only have they caught up, they've passed us. With this kind of performance, to be able to still thump your chest and say that I'm doing something good means that your words are totally dislocated from your actual delivery.
And in fact, the paradox is that despite this dark and dismal verdict, it's a damning verdict, Modi remains incredibly popular. And you explain that popularity on the grounds that either what he did or what he didn't do in 2002 has forever validated him. You write, even if people acknowledge arguable failure on the side of governance, Modi's delivering what they want on the side of identity and passion. So they're prepared to forgive, forget, and overlook the entire collapse of governance over 7 years because he's giving them that Hindu identity and reassurance that they've been craving for, and that's why they champion him.
I think so. I think that there are 2 points to be made here. One is that all of South Asia is a majoritarian. We thrive on bullying our minorities. And this is true of all the nations of our region, which used to once be one large space run by the British. The other point is that if you look at the decades that Mr. Nehru and Mrs. Gandhi were a prime minister, if you look at the economic performance, it was quite poor, but they remained popular. So I think that we need to ask ourselves why it is that politics in India, democratic and popular politics, dissociates in some sense a performance from a popularity.
In other words, the people, because of a emotional identification with their rulers, forgive and forget poor economic performance.
or they do not hold them to account for what is going on in their lives.
Right at the end of your book, there's a very clear hint that the 7 years of Modi represent a terrible missed opportunity for India. You write, Narendra Modi had the capital, the adoration of crores, and no opposition. He could, if he had the plan and wanted to, sell and push through transformational change. That failure to do it is the opportunity India has lost. No one else had the power to do it. He simply didn't have the vision or the will.
I think so. And I don't think that we will have somebody of this level of popularity, this level of acceptance, this level of lack of opposition for some time. And I think that he has not only squandered his own legacy, which I think is a minor thing, but I think that he's ruined it for this country and for the millions and for the hundreds of millions of poor that we have, who will not have a chance to come into a middle income. And I think that is a disaster.
In fact, as a result of this missed opportunity, would you say the squandered opportunity, you see a pretty dim future for India. You write, India has likely forever missed the opportunity to join the ranks of the developed countries. And this is because the failure of the Modi years coincided with what you said should have been years of demographic growth for India. And consequently, you write, India will likely remain at the low end of the middle income trap. That's a damning verdict for the country.
It is, and it's quite sad, but the facts are these, that India entered the period of what ought to have been its demographic dividend when a larger part of the population was old enough to work in 2018. But what has happened post-2014 is that the labor force participation rate, those in the country who are either working or are looking for work, has shrunk by a fifth. So Mr. Modi shrank the size of the workforce from 52%, which it was when he took over, and this is a government data, to 40%, which is amongst the lowest in the world, lower than Pakistan. It's in the lowest 16 nations of the world.
So the conclusion we're coming to, both of his character traits and flaws, as well as his performance as prime minister, is the following. He saw himself as a hero, but he didn't think through what he was doing. He was divisive, but he was unlearned. He therefore was reckless and impetuous, and he imposed on India decisions like demonetization, like a lockdown at 4 hours' notice, that were disastrous for the people. But there's the other side of it, which emerges from his performance. He had enormous power. He could have changed the country. He could have transformed it. And that opportunity to do so has been missed. And as you say, the consequence will be that we will be at the low end of the middle income trap hereafter. In other words, he's sold India's future down the river.
He has. I think that he's been very successful in dividing us, in introducing levels of hatred and division, which will be very hard and will take decades for us to be rid of. But he's been unsuccessful in trying to make sure that India joins the ranks of the developed nations, or at least starts to plan its route to there. We have no plan, and I think we are in worse shape as an economy than we've ever been in the past. And I don't think that we're going to get out of this easily.
In which case, one last question, Aakar Patel. Do you see any possibility of political change on the horizon, or at least in the foreseeable future? Or does Mr. Modi's undiminished popularity, and I suppose the irreversible weakness of the opposition, do they together ensure that the Modi era will continue for years and years?
I think it will actually continue. There are structural advantages that the BJP has in many parts of the country. It has a lot of money. And the opposition has almost no resource at the moment. And this is due primarily to a law that Mr. Modi passed on bonds. And I think that because of these structural differences, even though there might be a slip in his popularity, which I think will come at some point, it will be difficult to dislodge the BJP as the primary force in politics here. And I think that with that, we will also have the accompaniment of the sort of laws that they are focused on, which are aimed primarily at minority groups within the country.
In which case, one last question. One day, Mr. Modi will have to cease to be Prime Minister. Age or the inevitable will ensure that. At that point, if the BJP continues, how do you see the future of the country under Amit Shah, who many believe will be Mr. Modi's successor?
They don't have any specific ideology to offer outside of their majoritarianism. If you look at, as I said, what they have said over the decades on national security, on the economy, there is no consistency. They have no roadmap to anywhere except the brutalization of fellow Indian citizens. And that is what will continue to happen under any successor that comes after Mr. Modi.
What a very depressing prospect. Thank you very much for opening our eyes. But I think there would be many in the audience who wish that what you've shown them had never been seen. Take care, Aakar Patel. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.